I was hoping everybody was going to solve all the difficulties surrounding the Kirtland Egyptian papers, the papyri, and how Joseph Smith translated them, and all the facsimiles and what's going on there. But it looks like we're going to have to wait. But I am grateful for this opportunity to respond to the work of these three great people, and I admire the things that they do. Taken together, the papers that they've delivered in this session addresses two questions of history regarding Joseph Smith and antiquity. One, what was the extent and nature of Joseph Smith's interaction with or knowledge of conventional academic studies of Egyptian? And two, what was the extent and nature of Joseph Smith's interaction with Egyptian artifacts in general? John Gee's paper addresses number one, and all three of them address number two. So concerning number one, in 1994, my professor, David Silverman, published in a Festschrift for his professor, Klaus Baer, an article by John Larson on Joseph Smith and Egyptology, wherein Larson states, the purpose of this article is to introduce to a wider Egyptological audience some of the earliest evidence for speculation about ancient Egyptian by Americans during the years 1835 to 1844. At a time when the pioneering work of Jean-Francois Champollion had attained very limited circulation in Europe and was completely unknown in the Western Hemisphere. This statement serves as both a preface and an explanation point to what John Gee has outlined for us, that the conventional academic study of ancient Egyptian languages was non-existent in America during Joseph's lifetime. However, to be clear, Champollion's work was not completely unknown in the Western Hemisphere in 1835 to 1844. To the contrary, his work was known and being reviewed in American journals years before Chandler arrives in Kirtland. John Gee mentioned the 1830 publication in Boston containing an alphabet of Egyptian characters based on Champollion's work. Pushing back even further, in 1923, the North American Review published a review of a 1922 French pamphlet concerning the Temple of Dendra Zodiac. Bushman mentioned this yesterday, indicated that Champollion's work, already carried so far, may soon throw some light on the hieroglyphs within this scene. In 1829, Henry Wheaton, a graduate of Brown University, sorry, I'm a little ahead of myself on the slides, a graduate of Brown University, a lawyer and a diplomat, appears to have read and reviewed an 1827 publication of Champollion, focusing on his his work, which verified much of the Egyptian king lists given in the ancient classical sources, such as those attributed to Manetho. Through Champollion's work, Wheaton is also familiar with the nature of hieroglyphic signs being a mixture of phonetics and ideograms, and dismisses the previous notions that the characters were solely symbolic in nature. And that's what you see here. Many European publications concerning antiquity, including some of Champollion's work, were being read and reviewed in America within a year or two after they appeared in Europe. So the Atlantic does not have to be seen as too insular. Americans' familiarity with Champollion's progress may have given classical scholars such as Charles Anthon confidence that they too would soon be able to translate Egyptian themselves. However, as John outlined, only single characters, words, and names were being identified within the emerging science of Egyptology. No one in America or even in Europe were successfully translating lines of texts in Joseph Smith's day. Church historical accounts appear to concur with this general lack of ability to translate Egyptian lines of text in America. Oliver Cowdery's letter to Fry, published in the Messenger and Advocate, reports that Michael Chandler was immediately told, while yet in the custom house picking up the mummies, that there was no man in that city who could translate his roll. But then Cowdery made an interesting remark only a few lines later. While Mr. Chandler was in Philadelphia, he used every exertion to find someone who could give him the translation of his papyrus, but could not, satisfactorily, Though some few men of first eminence, he obtained in a small degree the translation of a few characters. If the 1830 publication in Boston containing Champollion's alphabetic meaning of a few characters, including their hieratic equivalents, is any indication, learned individuals in 1833 Philadelphia giving the meaning of a few characters of Chandler's text, but not the text itself, is a historical possibility. However, there are other possibilities for how one could explain Cowdery's report, assuming it is accurate, which brings us to the second thing that all three papers have addressed, namely the extent and nature of Joseph Smith's interactions with Egyptian text and figures in general. Cowdery goes on to say that being solicited by Mr. Chandler to give an opinion concerning his antiquities or translation of some of the characters, Joseph Smith gave him the interpretation of some few for his satisfaction. It should be noted here that while believers take seriously those moments when Joseph Smith claims he is giving divine revelation, one need not assume that Joseph is always speaking a revelation. When Joseph is asked by Chandler to give his initial opinion of the papyri, in general, there does not appear in the sources to be any claim that Joseph is using heavenly assistance to make these initial, seemingly off-the-cuff translation of some few characters on the papyri. Only later, when Joseph studies more intently the documents, do claims of revelation and writings of patriarchs enter into the historical sources. After Joseph gives his initial opinions and translations of a few characters of the papyri, Cowdery reports that Chandler issued a certificate stating that Joseph Smith's translations correspond to those of the learned in Philadelphia to whom he showed the papyri earlier. So what's going on here? Again, assuming the report is accurate, and we must start there, here are some possibilities. First, Joseph and those in Philadelphia were extremely familiar with Champollion's work, including some of the alphabetic characters, and were able to give comments that happened to match. Our current understanding of the publications and their distribution, which John pointed out, in part, suggests that this is not likely. A second possibility is that the translation of Joseph and those in Philadelphia were not translations in a conventional academic sense, but rather were speculations concerning the symbolic nature of the characters, a method of translation that was popular prior to Champollion's discoveries as addressed earlier. That Joseph and those in Philadelphia happened to say similar things is unlikely, given the large amount of things one could say when speculating about the symbolic meaning of hundreds of unknown individual characters. Number three, the third possibility, Joseph and the learned in Philadelphia are not actually commenting on the characters in the texts. Rather, they are simply providing some interpretations of the pictures on the papyri. And Cowdery calls these interpretations translations. In a similar manner, the last line of the explanations for facsimile number 2, published in the Times and Seasons, states, "The above translation is given as far as we have any right to give at the present time." Ooh, where am I? Did I skip that? Sorry. I must have skipped that. Okay. The above translation, this is facsimile number 2, the above translation is given as far as we have any right to give at the present time. Actually, none of the explanations for facsimile number 2 are actual translations of any of the texts in the vignette. Rather, they are only interpretations of the pictures. It would not be too far a stretch for the learned in Philadelphia and Joseph, both possibly conditioned by Judeo-Christian concepts from the Bible and antiquity in general, to give similar opinions about the meaning of some of the pictures that they saw on the papyri. Unfortunately, we do not know what Joseph said to Chandler at this moment, and thus a firm conclusion is elusive. However, I'd like to insert here, I guess, we've looked at the academia as far as text translations is concerned, but I wonder if an area that could be explored a little bit more that hasn't been, to my knowledge, is what is the academia of, iconography and the viewing of pictures in ancient documents. Even though they can't translate the text, they could probably have some ideas about what these pictures are saying, at least maybe using, other languages, other cultures, other ancient ideas about what these things might be. However, the possibility that Joseph is speculating on the meaning of some of the pictures causes us to turn to Carey's paper. When discussing the various interpretations or explanations of the pictures on Joseph Smith's papyri, both those published with the Book of Abraham and those that were not, Carey rightly points out that it is not easy to determine which ideas were originally Joseph Smith's and which were not. To make our methodology sound, those statements wherein someone actually attributes the idea to Joseph Smith should become our main source for further investigation. But we need to be clear on what is actually attributed to him. For example, the storekeeper that showed Caswall the papyri said, here it is. Said this, Mr. Smith informs us that this picture is an emblem of redemption. Do you see those four little figures? That is the old devil desiring to devour the four corners of the earth. Look at this person keeping back the big dog. That is Jesus Christ keeping the devil from devouring the four corners of the earth. Look down this way. This figure near the side is Jacob, and these are his two wives. Now do you see those steps? What? I replied, do you mean the stripes across the dress? Yes, that's Jacob's ladder. Of all the interpretations given here, the only one that the shopkeeper directly attributes to Joseph Smith is that he said the picture as a whole was an emblem of redemption. All the other interpretations concerning Christ, Satan, four quarters, Jacob's ladder, etc., are not directly attributed to Joseph Smith in this source. And as far as I know, the other sources don't make a direct association with him, and thus could have come from someone else or from the mind of the storekeeper himself. It's not clear. Likewise, while Joseph Smith is certainly involved in the publication of the Book of Abraham and its associated pictures, and it's been stated a couple times already, we don't have a historical statement telling us who wrote, right, the facsimile explanations. Indeed, of all the interpretations of the pictures in the papyri mentioned in Carey's paper, the only idea that is directly attributed to Joseph Smith, the only ideas I should say, is this one, that this is an emblem of redemption, and the ideas of Abraham's signature. What we are seemingly getting from all these is a bigger picture about early Mormonism and not necessarily a real firm picture of perhaps Joseph. At least we can't prove that. On church history speculations concerning the identity of the mummies, Carey provides some examples that attribute Joseph Smith as saying they are royalty. But these examples should be tempered with the editorial preface to Cowdery's letter to Fry, recounting the events of Chandler and the mummies and the Messenger and Advocate. And then that was up here earlier, sorry about that. So it was first in the Messenger and Advocate, it ends up in the 1838 church history of the church. And so I'm going to read you the original, and then the bottom one there is how it ends up in the history of the church. It has been said that the purchasers of these antiquities pretend that they have the body of Abraham, Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, Joseph, who was sold into Egypt, etc., for the purposes of attracting the attention of the multitude and gulling the unwary, which is utterly false. For the purpose of correcting these and other erroneous statements concerning both the mummies and also the records, we give an extract of a letter written by a friend in this place who possesses correct knowledge concerning this matter to a gentleman who resides at a distance. This is the preface to Cowdery's letter. Who these ancient inhabitants of Egypt are, we do not pretend to say, neither does it matter to us. It has been said, Indeed, Cowdery states in his letter later, I do not consider them, speaking of the mummies, of much value compared with the records which were deposited with them. Okay, lastly, we turn to the question of Joseph Smith's involvement with the KEP, which Brian and John address. Brian divides the documents into mostly Book of Abraham and mostly Egyptian, with some overlap, suggesting that these two indicate two separate efforts of Joseph Smith and others, one perhaps in a quest of pure language, and another, the revelatory process for obtaining the Book of Abraham. In the paper that Brian gave me, he states, whether or not the Egyptian project began before or after the arrival of the papyri, it appears that the arrival of the Egyptian papyri fueled for Joseph Smith and others both a secular study of the ancient Egyptian language and a revelatory pursuit concerning the writings of Abraham. These two interests appear to have worked in tandem with each other in bringing forth both the Egyptian papers and the Book of Abraham. As I've listened to the various presentations yesterday and today, there seems to be a pattern around Joseph Smith's revelatory experiences that it's coming into focus. If Mike McKay is correct, Joseph had a period of time with the gold plates and the interpreters where he was kind of left to his own devices to figure out how to translate the golden plates and to figure out what he had, and how to get it translated, including his efforts to create an alphabet, to solicit help from the learned as he sends Martin Harris off. The revelation of the Book of Mormon, after Joseph puts forth this, personal effort, the revelation of the Book of Mormon then begins to flow almost nonstop. Joseph struggled and debates with Sidney Rigdon over passages of the Bible preceding the revelations of the Joseph Smith translation. Of course, this pattern, I'll skip that. Does this pattern fit the Book of Abraham? The 1835 text of the KEP includes passages from most parts of the Book of Abraham that may suggest it has already been translated and then used after the fact in the speculations of the Egyptian papers. Brian suggests that these fragments of text, in contrast, Brian suggests that these fragments of text beyond Abraham's second and 18 could also simply be evidence of notes taken before a final translation session to set them into a narrative form in March of 1842. So there's two views going on here. There's one that the Book of Abraham is all translated completely by Joseph. We don't really know when when he completed it. And then the KEP papers, the Book of Mormon, the Book of Abraham project, the Egyptian project, kind of draws on the completed translation. And then Brian has other thoughts that maybe we are actually looking at, because there are some segments, some pieces of the Book of Abraham from all the Book of Abraham that show up in the Egyptian papers, but Brian suggests maybe these are actually just some notes that Joseph Smith actually formulates later into the complete Book of Abraham as he translates it in 1840 or publishes in 1842. Okay. So Brian suggests that if that is true, then perhaps Joseph is giving over to struggling with the papyri, creating an alphabet, adopting some views and looking at, trying to do these things on their own. And that this becomes a precedent to the actual translation. The problems with this, I think, are that the work surrounding the KEP seems to have started before the papyri enters the pictures, as has been mentioned. And two, this would be the only example of Joseph taking notes or developing kind of a translation. It seems that Joseph, when he's actually giving us text, it just flows. So, as we stop and think about this pattern, though, of Joseph struggling on his own with things and then coming to some revelation, we are reminded that this pattern began with Joseph Smith's struggle to discover which church to join. Using his own study of the Bible, the 1832 account of the history of the church, Joseph talks about how he pored over the Bible and tried to figure it out for himself, went to these different churches and compared them to what he was learning from the scriptures and not being able to discover which church is true. Only when he exhausted his own resources and discovered that he lacked wisdom, time after time after time, do the miracles occur. So may we see in Joseph a pattern for our own lives as we press forward with our own natural efforts and speculations on the questions at hand. And when we go, and when we can go no further, and we lack wisdom, may we ask God and hope for the further light and knowledge that only heaven can give. Thank you.